Hello and welcome to Biblical Breadcrumbs, where today we're in 1 Samuel chapter 15 and talking about Saul being a bad king. If you remember the story in 1 Samuel, basically what's happening is the Israelites are coming off of the Judges period, and they don't really like all the things that they've seen. Over the Judges period, they were a bunch of independent little states formed in their different little tribes, and they kind of worked together, but they mostly just did their own thing. They had a very, decentralized government. They just kind of were all independently governed and realized that that was not going to go very well for them. Unfortunately, their solution to it was calling in the aid of a king. They looked at all the nations around them, saw that they all had kings, and said, hey, we want to be just like them. We want one guy over all of us that we can all pay attention to. Of course, they ignored the fact that God was the one guy who was over all of them that they could just pay attention to. They decided not to pay attention to God, and instead of being obedient to him, they asked for a king anyway. Well, God decided to give them one. And it's an interesting point to think about, that God, I think, very clearly had plans for there being a king at some point. He had organized there being kingship in Deuteronomy, back in Deuteronomy 17 or 18. He has rules for a king. Some people think that's a later insertion from a later time period, but I don't think so. I think that was back in Deuteronomy's day. When you have a king, this is how he's supposed to act. I think that's something that Moses wrote down back in the day, but people disagree with that. You can disagree with that if you want to. We can move on. It seems clear to me that God always had in mind there was a plan for some kind of king, at least, because David ends up being this representative picture of ultimately Jesus. And the way God interacts with David sets up Jesus coming in the future. David is very clearly meant to be someone important, and I think David was always planned to come about. The only problem is Israel started asking for a king about 40 years too early. And so God gave them a king, but it wasn't a very good one. His name is Saul. He's picked to be a king because he is tall and he is handsome, and that's the important thing. He is not very capable, not very wise, not very, anything good. He's not very positive. He's just kind of rash and not a good choice, and yet that's the kind of person Israel wanted. They wanted a guy who looked pretty and was impressive and imposing as he was tall. And so God gave them that. And this is where it all starts to fall apart. Now God is about to go and select David as the real king in 1 Samuel 16. But one of the reasons he does that, one of the reasons he goes ahead and anoints David, I think, is because in 1 Samuel 15, a lot of terrible stuff happens, and Saul just kind of falls off the wagon incredibly hard. 1 Samuel 15 is the story of Saul being told to slaughter the Amalekites, failing to slaughter the Amalekites, and being judged because of it. So we'll talk about that a little bit today, as well as some things, a lot of things that happen when you disobey God, and the consequences that come from that, as kind of a cautionary tale that you shouldn't be like Saul. We're going to read 1 Samuel 15. We'll go ahead and read the whole chapter because the first few verses give you the context of what's just happened, and then the last two-thirds of the chapter tell you all the consequences of of Saul's disobedience and what all comes out of that. 1 Samuel 15, I'll start reading in verse 1. Then Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you as a king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore listen to the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord of armies says. I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, in that he obstructed him on the way while he was coming up from Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek, and completely destroy everything that he has, and do not spare him, but put to death both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." Then Saul summoned the people and counted them in Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the wadi. But Saul said to the Kenites, "Go, get away, get down from among the Amalekites, so that I do not destroy you along with them. For you showed kindness to all the sons of Israel when they went up from Egypt." So the Kenites got away from among the Amalekites. Then Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah, going down toward Shur, which is east of Egypt. He captured Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and completely destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the more valuable animals, the lambs, and everything that was good, and were unwilling to destroy them completely. But everything despicable and weak, that they completely destroyed. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I regret that I have made Saul king, because he has turned back from following me, and has not carried out my commands. And Samuel was furious and cried out to the Lord all night. Samuel got up early in the morning to meet Saul, and it was reported to Samuel, saying, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a monument for himself, then turned and proceeded on down to Gilgal. So Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed are you of the Lord, I have carried out the command of the Lord. But Samuel said, What then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears, and the bellowing of the oxen which I hear? Saul said, They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but the rest we have completely destroyed. Then Samuel said to Saul, Stop, let me inform you of what the Lord said to me last night. And he said to him, Speak. Verse 17. So Samuel said, Is it not true, though you were insignificant in your own eyes, that you became the head of the tribes of Israel? For the Lord appointed you as king over Israel. And the Lord sent you on a mission, and said, Go and completely destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are eliminated. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Instead you loudly rushed upon the spoils, and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Then Saul said to Samuel, I did obey the voice of the Lord, for I went on a mission on which the Lord sent me, and I have brought Agag king of Amalek, and have completely destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took some of the spoils, sheep and oxen, the choicest of the things designated for destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. Samuel said, Does the Lord have as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than a sacrifice, and to pay attention is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as reprehensible as the sin of divination, and insubordination is as reprehensible as false religion and idolatry. Since you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. For I have violated the command of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people and listened to their voice. Now then, please pardon my sin, and return with me, so that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. Then Samuel turned to go, but Saul grasped the edge of his robe and tore it off. So Samuel said to him, The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to your neighbor, who is better than you. Also the glory of Israel will not lie nor change his mind, for he is not a man that he would change his mind. Then Saul said, I have sinned, but please honor me now before the elders of my people and before all Israel, and go back with me so that I may worship the Lord your God. So Samuel went back following Saul, and Saul worshipped the Lord. Then Samuel said, Bring me Agag, king of the Amalekites. And Agag came to him cheerfully. And Agag said, Surely the bitterness of death is gone. But Samuel said, As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel cut Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. 34. Then Samuel went up to Ramah, but Saul went up to his house at Gibeah of Saul. And Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, though Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. It's a long reading, but hopefully it gets that point across. There are 3 basic sections in this chapter. You can actually divide this thematically a few different ways, but for my purposes, we're going chronologically, and the 3 different sections in this chapter would be talking about the assignment he's given, verses 1 through 3, the assignment Saul has, that God gives to Saul for Saul to act on. The action that Saul takes in verses 4 through 9 is very simple because it's straight-up disobedience. And then the rest of the chapter, verses 10 through 35, just deals with the accountability of the situation, the things you owe, and the things that Saul owes, and the things that Saul is going to be punished for. You have this simple idea. It's an assignment in verses 1 through 3. And Saul, it's not a complicated assignment, but Saul manages to goof it up anyway. It's a simple job, is to wipe out Amalek. Amalek is a foreign nation. God says, kill them all completely. No survivors. He says very specifically in verse 3, I can't read numbers apparently, put to death both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So there you have the 8 categories of being, I suppose. All your men and women, all your children, which would be, under the age of 12 or whatever the fabled age of accountability is, if you use that term, if you think in that way. Men and women who are adults and in charge of their own choices, children who are not as much in charge of their own choices or maybe not quite as responsible for them, infants who are not even able to walk or talk or anything like that. Just kill them all. Woof. Well, that sounds kind of harsh. And so the first question, when people come to this passage, the first question, kind of a natural question to ask is, wait a second, isn't this like really bloodthirsty from God? Isn't this really violent? Wait, maybe, is this good? Are we sure that this is good? Or was this a righteous thing to do? Or maybe is this a little bit violent and messed up? Is this even a good thing? Should Saul even be doing this? Like, I know God said to, and we'll talk about that as one of the reasons why later on, but even when you just hear this command, just kind of murder everything, is this righteous, and should Saul be doing it? Well, here are 4 different reasons why Saul should be doing it. People have this complaint against the Old Testament that God is bloodthirsty, or God is evil, or God is hateful, and he just hates people, and he kills people all the time, and it's really rough. He's the God of judgment and not the God of mercy. The God of the New Testament is the God of mercy, and the God of the Old Testament is the God of justice. Those people are people who haven't read the Bible and don't understand that the Old and New Testaments cover the same God, and they don't understand how merciful God is in the Old Testament. But we'll talk a little bit about that. Actually here, yes, God is judging, and yes, God is passing judgment, but one reason this command is justified is actually cited in verse 2. God had promised, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, in that he obstructed him on the way when he was coming up from Egypt. And so you go back and read that. What did Amalek do to Israel previously? Something happened that is spawning this kind of animosity, or it's spawning God's hatred of this people, if you want to phrase it that way. God is fighting against Amalek. Why is he doing it? Well, Exodus 17, verses 8 through 16, introduce us to this idea, where Israel is traveling through the desert. They're on their way to Sinai. And in Exodus 17 and verse 8, Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. This is the instance where Moses has to stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in his hand, and when he holds the staff up, Israel wins, and when he lowers the staff, Israel loses. And so Aaron and Hur help him to prop the staff up, and Joshua defeated Amalek and the people with the edge of the sword. Exodus 17 verse 13. That's the conclusion. Then you have this little epitaph in verses 14, 15, and 16. The Lord said to Moses, write this in a book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly wipe out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and named it, The Lord is my banner, and said, because the Lord has sworn, and the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation. Israel is a group of mostly stragglers, people who don't know how to fight. They were peasants, they were slaves back in Egypt. They've just been rescued. They are wandering in the wilderness, and Amalek attacks a group of untrained individuals to try and do something horrible to them. God says that is unacceptable and declares war upon them, that horrible things will happen to them because of the evil that they have done. And actually, it gets worse when you go over to Deuteronomy 25. There's a kind of repetition of this command actually built into the second giving of the law. Deuteronomy 25, verse 17, God is speaking, and he says, remember what Amalek did to you. Or, well, Moses is speaking, but God is speaking through Moses. There's a conflation of the two. This is the divine command from God himself. Remember what Amalek did to you on the way when you came out of Egypt. Listen to what they did. How he confronted you on the way and attacked among you all the stragglers at your rear, and when you were tired and weary, and he did not fear God. So it shall come about, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your surrounding enemies in the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, that you shall wipe out the mention of the name Amalek from under heaven. You must not forget. Verses 17 through 19 share something interesting. What was Amalek's strategy? It's not like these are warring peoples. It's not like, hey, Israel is coming as this mighty army and Amalek goes out to fight them as an army. Amalek waited until they were tired from a day's march, or they were tired as they're going through the desert, and they haven't eaten too much, and they haven't drunk too much, and they haven't slept, and there are a bunch of stragglers at the back of the line. And then Amalek, like the lazy predator, goes and attacks the weak who can't defend themselves. Amalek were the ones who were preying on the back of the baggage train while any armed warriors would be in the front. Amalek was taking advantage, targeting the weak, the defenseless, the orphans and the widows, as we would say, in the back of the line. No one could protect them, and that's when Amalek attacked. These are not good people. These are nasty individuals, and God declares that that is unrighteous. Amalek's MO, their modus operandi, seems to be waiting until the real force is out of the way, waiting until the competent individuals are gone, and then assaulting those who cannot protect themselves. What kind of people does that? There's a reason the command is justified. Amalek, it seems, has either did that to Israel, or maybe why did they do it to Israel? Probably because they've done it before to other people and it's worked. Amalek has made a history, presumably, I'm speaking on presumption here, Amalek seems to have made a history of doing evil to these people, and then you wonder why God comes in and says, well, destroy them. God promised he would wait until Israel was settled. That's why it didn't happen during the Judges period, because a ton of other things are going on that they need to deal with more directly. But in Samuel, in 1 Samuel 15, when Israel is finally settled, it's time to judge Amalek. God gave them warning, and after a long time, however many years it's now been, God is coming back around to accomplish that judgment. He has warned them. They've had time to prepare. They've had time to get their souls right with God. And now God expects them to be taken out so that they can't destroy anyone else ever again. Yes, the command is justified. When people say that God is bloodthirsty, or God demands genocide, or whatever the popular term to throw around the day is, yes, against evil people. Yeah, the command is justified because God is clearing up evil. And sometimes, here's the second defense, sometimes evil doesn't have to affect you personally to be destroyed. That's a significant point that we should think about. Israel is commanded at various points in the Old Testament to go and destroy a group of people. Maybe it's not because that group of people has wronged them personally, but it is that group of people has done evil on a cosmic scale against people in their local lands and against God himself, and God is holding them accountable. Just because Israel hasn't been the one that's personally hurt by every single group in Canaan doesn't mean they can't be the ones to bring justice to them. Some evil needs destroying even if it hasn't affected you personally. I mean, imagine being a judge in a courtroom and you go in and someone has stolen something and you're presiding over the trial a trial where, someone has stolen, has gone in and robbed a bank or whatever it is. Can you imagine a judge who says, well, I haven't been stolen from, so therefore that's not a real crime and it doesn't matter? Of course not. We're expected to pass judgment on evil. A judge is expected to look at that and say, look, evil has been done, it must be punished. The judge doesn't need to be personally affected for evil to be destroyed. Just because you haven't been stolen from doesn't mean you let other people get away with stealing. Now, this doesn't mean that you go as an individual to go and exact justice. Actually, the Old Testament is very specific about this. You don't go as an individual. There are rare occasions where, if you have a family member who's been murdered, you, as a relative of that family member, are to go and exact justice on that, but just as often you're supposed to go and do it in a court. And oftentimes when when someone manslaughters someone else, a relative of yours, someone manslaughters your father, you're supposed to go and take justice for that, but that person can go and run away to the city of refuge, one of the Levite cities, and hide out there and live there and work there and survive there in that instance instead of being absolutely killed. It's not the individual's job to go and exact justice for everything. It's not for them to go and enact justice or exact vengeance or do whatever and murder whoever else because you murdered my father, so I'll murder yours. You can't do that, right? That's not what God is talking about. But God does God does hold people accountable. Reading the wrong line in my notes there. God does hold people accountable, and he calls the government to come in and punish evil. Even if you jump over to the New Testament, Romans 13, I have this written down a little bit later on. Romans 13 is very clear. The government has been given the sword. Why? The government doesn't bear the sword in vain. They can make evildoers suffer. Maybe the evildoer does something against that government. Maybe it does something against another government. But the government is required by law, by God's expectation, to hold people accountable for crimes they've done, whether or not it's affected that particular government, or whether or not it's affected that particular judge. When you're thinking about God sending Israel in to go and kill Amalek, yes, it's because Amalek did horrible things to Israel. Yes, it hasn't happened for a long time. It was many years ago, as you're reading in 1 Samuel, but also the presumption is they've continued on being evil. They've probably not changed their ways. Amalek is not a great country from anything else we hear about in the Bible, and so it's not surprising that Israel would be sent in to clear up the mess, even if it has been however long since Amalek has done these things. You don't need to be personally affected to see an evil and go and correct it according to a righteous pattern. That's where number 3 comes in, which is God has commanded this. And when God commands it, you do stuff that is unpleasant, and you do even stuff that you don't personally like. God is your authority. God is the creator of the world. God's the one who made you. He gets to tell you what to do. You can always choose to refuse him. You can choose to ignore him. It won't go well for you ultimately, but you have free will. You have that ability to choose. Still, God commanded this. And when God commands this, you don't get the option of opting out. You don't get to say, no, I don't think so. I'll do something else instead. This wiping out of Amalek, I don't really care. Saul may have enjoyed it. Saul may not have enjoyed it. It doesn't really matter because God has said that you should do it. And Saul is going to be obedient. The annihilation is not the bloodthirstiness of man going out and destroying another people. This annihilation is coming from God's will, and it's not from Saul's will. It is a higher calling. When people go out and execute justice in the Old Testament, when Israel goes in and wipes out the land of Canaan, when Israel goes in and wipes out Amalek, or whichever nation they're happening to pick on at the time, it's not just Israel decided to go to war with this people because they wanted to. It's because God told them to. And if God tells you to do something, you do that thing. Should Saul do it? Yes, because it's justified. Amalek did a bunch of evil against Israel previously. Should Saul do it? Yes, because some evil needs destroying. Even if it hasn't affected Saul personally, he should still go out and see justice and righteousness done. Should Saul do it? Yeah, because God told him to. And it doesn't really matter. He may not like it personally. It may not make him feel good. It may not make him feel comfortable or whatever. But God still said to do it. And if God commands, then you must obey. And fourth, here's the other side of all of this. Fourth, just on a practical level, instead of like a theological level or trying to justify things, fourth, on the practical level, if you are the king like Saul, you are going to have to deal with some stuff that is going to be quite unpleasant to you. The heads of different countries they don't get to avoid things that make them uncomfortable. And that's kind of important to remember. Saul is called upon to get his hands dirty primarily because he is the king. The Lord has sent me to anoint you as king over his people. In verse 1, now therefore go and kill Amalek. If Saul wasn't the king, he wouldn't have to go and kill Amalek, would he? But people who are in positions of authority, people who are the king of a nation, people who are in charge, are often called to do things that are unpleasant and distasteful to them personally. Christians are not forbidden to serve in the government, or Christians are not forbidden from serving in the government or in the military or something like that. You're not forbidden from being a policeman or whatever it is. But whenever people ask me if that's something they should do, I always say it's fine if you want to do it, but be careful, because there's stuff like this where Saul is called to do something he may not personally like to do, but that is part of the job, and that goes with the authority that he has. It's not evil. It's a righteous thing. God is commanding it, so you know it's not evil, and yet it may well make a lot of people uncomfortable, and Saul has to go and do it anyway, and he's judged if he doesn't go and do it anyway. There's nothing that forbids you as a Christian, even if you look at the New Testament, there's nothing that forbids you for serving in the government or from serving in the military or any branch therein, but you do have to be careful, because sometimes if you enter into that, you may get involved in a war you don't agree with, or you may have to do an operation that kind of makes you uncomfortable, or you may have to do things that are potentially even questionable. There's a line at which, hey, that's going to cross the lines of God. I'm not going to obey that. And so, hey, get fired from your job instead. Sure. But there is a line at which, hey, I'm personally not very comfortable with that, but it's not an evil thing to do. And so you may be forced to, or you may be pushed to do things against your preferences. If you're going to sign up for one of those jobs, or if you're going to occupy one of those positions, just be warned going in. You may have to do some unpleasant stuff. Is this righteous? Should Saul do it? Yes, he should. There is historical precedent for it. There is judgment precedent for it. There is divine precedent for it, and there is physical precedent for it. I probably should just write those down, because that's easier to say and to summarize than everything I just said. So people will argue that God is harsh. They'll look at something like this and say, oh, God is commanding the murder of a nation or whatever, so that's pretty harsh. Well, yeah, but yes, in the sense that, like, every punishment is harsh, and people don't like being punished for things that they've done. I mean, is God harsh when he holds people to account? When someone murders, is it harsh to kill them in return? When someone steals something, is it harsh to take that back and make them repay it? When someone tells an evil lie to get someone else convicted in court, is it harsh when that lie is overturned and that person who lied suffers the punishment that they were trying to foist on someone else? Is that harsh? I mean, you could say it's harsh because it doesn't allow you to do whatever you want to do, and you're held responsible and you're accountable for some of these things that you've done. Sure, from that perspective, sure, maybe it's like harsh, or if you want to use that term, but most people would just say that's justice. If someone has gone in and killed the weak and the straggler, if someone has just preyed upon the widow and the orphan and the innocent and the young and the naive and the incapable or the invalid or the cripple or the whatever, if someone has come in and taken advantage of those people, you know they need to be gotten rid of in some way. You know they need to be in prison. You know they need to pay a massive fine. You know they need to restore the damage that has been done. When someone comes in and kills all of those kinds of people, you know that person needs to be put down. When Amalek does that on a national level, you know that nation needs to be put down. That's the argument that God is going with. We understand it on an individual level, but then people get uncomfortable when we expand it to a global level. Or maybe people get uncomfortable with the idea that we should hold people accountable for their actions at all. Well, unfortunately, God is a just God, and God looks at the things you do and holds you accountable for what you chose to do or not do. Be very careful with that. Don't do evil, and then you don't have to suffer in the same way that these people do. Well, I don't think God is harsh. I think judgment comes on those who act unrighteously. I think God has given the government as part of the means of doing justice and producing judgment today, and judgment will come on them if they do their judgment unrighteously, if they do not hold people to account, or if they are too unmerciful and too harsh with those people. This is an unpleasant task that Saul has been given, but without this unpleasant task, evil continues unchecked. And which one's worse? For one nation to do something that is, well, it's not pleasant, or for another nation to continue on and keep doing their evil and make victims of everyone they come across. Which one is worse? People get mad when God intervenes directly and commands the slaughter of a people. But people also get mad when God lets those people live, and then those people take advantage of the poor and the helpless, and they ask where God is. It's a catch-22. It's a reminder that we live in a broken world, because most people who are raising complaints against God honestly just want God to not exist, because there is no answer that will satisfy them. If God commands, Saul goes and kills Amalek, they'll complain, God's commanding a genocide. And if God doesn't do anything and lets Amalek exist, they'll complain that Amalek continues to rape and murder every innocent person that they come across. Why isn't God doing anything? Well, at the end of the day, maybe you just need to say, God is intervening. It's a good thing when God intervenes. It's a blessing when he does. It's also a blessing when he shows mercy. And maybe we need to be a little bit more careful on how we pass judgment on God instead of passing judgment so freely on how God passes judgment on other people, if that makes sense. What was commanded, the assignment given to Saul was to wipe out Amalek. It's justified for a number of reasons, and people who think that this kind of behavior is unjustified or evil from God clearly don't understand what justice is, and thus have no ability to make solid judgments on what is justified and what isn't. If you try and tell me God is unjust, well, you don't know what you're talking about, and be careful with that kind of claim. So second section is very simple. It's the action. It's verses 4 through 9. There are two things that Saul does as he comes in. He gets his army together, and he goes ahead and deals two different ways with two different groups of people. He deals with first the Kenites in verse 6. He tells them to get out of there so that he doesn't have to kill the Kenites. And then he deals with the Amalekites in verse 7, which is he goes and kills the Amalekites. Well, two questions on this. Why spare the Kenites first? Why would he not kill them as well? Because God didn't tell him to. If God doesn't tell you to, you don't have the license to. But also, think back through the other examples, right? If you're the king, you're going to have to deal with unpleasant stuff. Okay, but you don't have to deal with more unpleasantness than you have to. If you're setting out to do justice against a people, you don't have to do justice against another people, and you don't have to inflict the same punishment against another people. That's not required. You might have to do justice against them, sure, but what have they actually done? You think about God commanding you to destroy Amalek. Well, God didn't command you to kill the Kenites, so you don't have to. Some evil needs destroying, even if it doesn't affect you personally. True, but some evil can also be permitted to exist from a governmental standpoint. It's not one government's job to police every other government in the world. Japan can't hold everybody else accountable. America can't hold everybody else accountable. China can't hold everybody else accountable. It's just not practical. So you don't have to pass judgment on all of these people if you don't, if you aren't commanded to, or if there isn't anything else necessitating it. And the other thing is, the slaughter of Amalek is justified because Amalek has done them evil. The pardoning of Kenite is justified because Kenite hasn't done anything evil to them. And actually, verse 6, Kenite did something good to Israel. So it would be unjustified to murder them, or to slaughter them. It's not murder. It is pre-planned. It's not murder, though. It is just killing like it should be. God didn't tell him to. They've done good to Israel. It would be unjust to do damage and to kill them. They are spared from death. Those who show mercy receive mercy. On the other hand, you have the Amalekites. Why kill the Amalekites? Well, because God told him to, because they've done evil, because their evil needs judging. They're continuing to do evil, and they need to be gotten rid of, presumably. Those who show no mercy receive no mercy. There's a very clear principle communicated there. Forgive as we forgive our debtors. If they don't forgive, well, they're not going to be forgiven. You have that picture that's right there. It's very, very obvious. So Saul goes in and decides to show mercy on those who deserve mercy and show vengeance or justice on those who deserve justice. Except for when Saul just kind of up and decides to show mercy regardless. And this is where this all falls apart, because verses 8 and 9, Saul goes in, verse 7, he defeats the Amalekites. He completely destroys all the people in verse 8, but then he leaves Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive. So he doesn't completely destroy all the people. He completely destroys all the people, but one of them's still alive. So, like, not actually completely. We would say it's generally, yeah, he just destroyed the Amalekites, but he also left one of them alive, and he wasn't supposed to. He was supposed to commit justice, especially on Agag, the king. You would think that it would be really important to bring the king and the leader of the whole nation to justice, and yet Agag, the king, the one who is commanding this evil stuff or overseeing all the evil that his people has and have done, why leave him alive? Out of all the people, you're leaving the ringleader alive? And then you have the animals, too. The animals were supposed to be slaughtered, but, verse 9, they were tainted, I guess, tainted with the evil of Amalek. But verse 9, Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, and the oxen, and the more valuable animals, and everything else that's good. So, basically, they killed the sick ones, because they didn't like the sick ones, but they took the rest of them. They treated it like a normal war, like you would go in and you would kill an enemy, and then you would loot all his stuff and take it back and remove it and bring it back. One of the points also to raise, if you think God is super bloodthirsty in the Old Testament, think about how people were operating in the Old Testament, because comparatively, God is really, really chill. People who are just going to war for no reason, people who are going to war to expand their territory, people who are going to war so that they can exact tribute from all these other nations and tax them to death. I mean, all these horrible things are happening, and then God is commanding a war not for resources. He's commanding a war for cosmic justice and earthly justice as well. He's just commanding a war for the righteous thing to be done, and he says there is no physical reward for going to war. Don't go to war like this, right? That's not what war is for. Be careful when you do these things. Just keep that in mind. God is very, very generous. He's very merciful, especially compared to every other nation at the time. Israel is supposed to get no reward from this, just the reward of doing righteousness. But Saul decides to take some animals for himself anyway. I don't know why he spared the king. Maybe it's to gloat. There's no real reason for him to have disobeyed in this instance. I don't know why he spared the animals. Well, I know he says it's to sacrifice, but still, that's not a good enough reason to disobey what God has commanded. Saul had a job, and Saul ignored the job. He ignored the assignment he has been given, and so there will be consequences. That's the action that Saul ended up taking. So finally, point 3, we get to the accountability part of this chapter, which is verses 10 through the end of it, everything else, 10 through 35. Saul disobeys the command of the Lord, and you might think it's a simple, God said do this, I didn't do this, oh, okay, sorry, moving on, but it's not. And the problem is people take disobedience way too lightly. When you disobey, there are consequences. When you disobey, it's a serious thing. And people who hand wave away disobedience and say it's not that important, they clearly don't understand what happens when you disobey God. So what happens when you disobey God? Here's a list of, it's beautiful. It's 7 different things that happen when you disobey God. Starting from verse 10, Samuel goes to confront Saul, and he hears from God, and then he goes to confront Saul. Firstly, you learn that when you disobey, God is upset in verse 11. I regret that I have made Saul king. Do you want God saying that about you? You had a job, you failed the job. What do you have left at that point? If you don't want God to say he regrets blessing you, don't go against him. That's what happens when you disobey. God regrets what he has given you and all the blessings and the life that he's given you because you've used it for evil. What happens, number 2, when you disobey, is God's people are upset. You see this in verse 11 a little bit. You also see it especially in verses 13 and 14. In verse 11, Samuel was furious. He cried out to the Lord all night. In verse 13, Samuel comes to Saul. Saul says, "Blessed are you of the Lord. I've carried out the command of the Lord." And Samuel says, "Shut up." Basically, verse 14, "If you have obeyed, why do I hear sounds of your disobedience?" Wow. What is that about? Right? Saul is trying to speak nicely to Samuel and buddy up to him, and Samuel just rejects every advance. Hey, what are we talking about? What do we have to talk about? You are so corrupt and evil. What are you even on about exactly? God's people are upset. And it's interesting that this point is raised here. The relationships we share with other people, with these other believers and other people under God, are based on that belief. When someone stops obeying God and when they stop following after God, then there's obviously going to be a hefty amount of relationship trouble. Because my relationship, the relationship between Saul and Samuel is based on them both being servants of the Lord, but Samuel is obedient to God and Saul is now disobedient to God. And how can those people get along? Because their relationship is based on God above them. The greatest commandment in the law is to love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself, but it's noteworthy. The love your neighbor as yourself is always the secondary commandment. Why do we always say love God first? It's love God, then love people. Because our love for people is based on our mutual connection to God. If our relationship is built on, if our relationship is not built on God, it's going to fall apart because nothing else is eternal. And if our relationship is built on God, then it is broken, or at the very least, heftily damaged when someone does evil against God and starts disobeying God. God's people are upset when you disobey God. God's people are upset with you. Don't do it. Third, what do you see? What do you see about disobedience? You see that you don't have any excuses for disobedience. Verses 19 through 21. Why didn't you obey the Lord? Why did you just run in and do what was evil? Saul said, "I did obey the voice of the Lord. I went and I've brought back Agag, king of Amalek, and have completely destroyed the Amalekites." If you've completely destroyed the Amalekites, you wouldn't have brought back King Agag, because he's an Amalekite. If you had completely obeyed the command of God in verse 21, the people took some of the spoils. Well, that wasn't me. That was the people who were doing that. Okay, who's the king? Who's in charge? Right? Isn't that Saul? Isn't Saul the one with authority? He did destroy Amalek, but not all of them. He did destroy the animals, but, well, the people didn't destroy all of them, and he just didn't bother didn't bother doing the right thing and commanding them to do the right thing. Did he really think he was going to get away with that? But he's trying to make an excuse. He's king. He's given a task. He's called to use his ability to actually perform that thing, and instead he keeps the king alive. He keeps Agag alive for no reason, or for whatever reason is inadequate, and he allows his people to run amok and do whatever it is they want to do. When God gives you a command, he's giving you something that you can do, and you have the obligation to obey. What is the excuse? What excuse are you going to use with God? People disobey because they think they have excuses. People disobey because they think they can just say, "Oh, well, I was having a tough day, so God will forgive me, so it's all fine." No, take obedience and disobedience seriously. People just don't pay attention to how important it is to actually obey the command of God. You have no excuse. Moses, Exodus chapter 3 and 4, will you quit making excuses? People won't listen to you? Fine, have a miracle. People don't understand you? Fine, have a different spokesperson. You don't feel comfortable with it? Tough. Feel comfortable with it. God pushes Moses anyway because Moses can, and Moses is accountable for it. You don't have excuses to use for why you disobeyed, so stop trying to use them. Goodness, it's not that difficult. But here we have Saul, who's using excuses, just like so many of us do as well. A fourth thing you learn from Saul's disobedience is it's better to ask permission than forgiveness. We have the cute little phrase in English that it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. In other words, if you don't know whether you should be doing the thing or not, just go ahead and do it and then ask afterwards, because it's better to ask forgiveness than it is for permission. Better to try something, and if it doesn't work, then apologize for it, or if it was unfitting or unsuitable, then apologize for it. Better to do that than to just clarify up front whether or not you should have done it. In different human matters, you can go either way. There's an argument to be made that that could be correct for various human enterprises, sure. But with God, it is not. Verses 22 and 23. Does the Lord have as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than to sacrifice. To pay attention is better than the fat of rams. You can always go out and do something and then offer a sacrifice afterwards to seek God's forgiveness. Okay, but God would prefer it if you just asked him if it was right. And then you wouldn't have to offer a sacrifice because you would know what is right and what is wrong. Better to ask permission than forgiveness with God. Arguably, that's true here physically on the earth in terms of like your job and stuff like that. Sure, arguably that's true, but divinely it's definitely true. Do not ask forgiveness instead of permission. God is honored the best through our obedience and not our creativity. God is honored the best when we do what he says instead of asking questions later and doing whatever we want to. If you're going to follow God, you do it how he says to, not however you came up with. And people don't understand this. Even when worshiping God, they'll worship God how they want to and worry about how God feels about it afterwards. Well, maybe we should think about what God wants first, and then we can come back around to what we might be able to do with that. Everything we have needs to be grounded on God. When it's not, you become a person like Saul. So people who, for instance, use musical instruments in worship because they think it sounds better, and ignore that musical instruments have never been a part of Christian worship in the first century all the way down through the 1500s when they were introduced and were very controversial, and then they weren't even common practice until like at least the 1800s over here in America, and even then it was pretty controversial. But people just do it because it sounds better, or people do it because they prefer it, or people do it because, you know, it's more entertaining, or it's more uplifting, or it's more whatever for them. Yeah, but what does God say about it? When you worship according to what you want, when you worship God according to what you want, you're not actually doing what God wants. You're not worshiping God, you're worshiping yourself and making excuses as to why it's okay to worship yourself, because obviously God was doing it, and God is pretty cool. Don't ask forgiveness rather than permission. Ask forgiveness if you must. But why not just ask permission first? Why not find out the truth first instead of going with your gut and then maybe checking later? Fifth thing you learn from Saul's disobedience is that sin brings lasting consequences. Verses 25 through 29. This is so important. Saul says, I have sinned, in verse 24. I violated the command of the Lord. Pardon my sin and return with me that I may worship the Lord. In other words, in verse 25, he's asking for forgiveness, and he's asking for Samuel to be with him. Notice he's asking for two different things. He's asking for forgiveness, presumably from God, and he's asking for Samuel to be with him, as in other people are around and other people are looking at him and approving of what or Samuel is around to approve of him and see what he is doing. But Samuel will not go because, as he says, Saul has been rejected as king. Verse 26. Notice, Samuel does not comment on forgiveness. I don't believe that if Saul is legitimate in asking for forgiveness, I don't think God is withholding forgiveness here. But Saul has been rejected as king, and there is no reason for Samuel to accompany him and keep up that facade anymore. Saul has been rejected as king. There is a consequence for what he did. It's not that God has not forgiven Saul. And it's not that, if God really forgave Saul, then he would let Saul continue to be king or whatever. That's rubbish, and we all know it. Stop. If you're trying to make that excuse, that's a silly excuse. Don't make that excuse. Nobody is saying anything about God refusing to forgive Saul, but even if God forgives Saul, there are still consequences. If you give someone your money, and he steals a bunch of your money, and then he says, when he's caught, he says, "I'm sorry, please forgive me." You can forgive him, but you will not trust him with your money again, will you? Because there are consequences to that. If someone is a murderer, sure, the family can forgive that person, but we shouldn't just let him back out into society for no punishment because he's a murderer. Yeah, kill him or put him in prison. Either way, I have personal preferences there, but one of those two should be the answer. There has to be some kind of penalty that's paid. Even if forgiveness is given, that doesn't mean the penalty is removed. Even if you are forgiven from your sin, that doesn't mean there are not lasting consequences. And people don't understand this, right? It's not that you can be an alcoholic for 20 years and then turn to God and be forgiven of your alcoholism. And then what? The temptation doesn't go away, does it? Because it's still there. There's something that still pulls you. There's something that's still calling to you. There's a lasting consequence for your actions. Even if you can be forgiven, there are consequences that come from that. People who are sexually promiscuous can turn around and they can be forgiven by God, and they can be righteous, and they can go to heaven. Great. But it doesn't mean they don't have scars from that background, and it doesn't mean that people are then willing to get married to that person because they're bringing a lot of baggage with them. And maybe that's not something that you want to opt into when you're looking for a spouse. Just because you're forgiven doesn't mean you don't have consequences. Be intelligent. People who do evil, there are two reasons that evil is bad. Number one, it's bad because God said so. It's a moral evil. It's a crime against righteousness, and so it's bad from that perspective. The other reason that sin is bad is because it's just bad for you. It gets inside, it rots your bones, it just makes your life physically here, it makes your life worse. Be careful with that. Sin brings lasting consequences, or at least it can, and you don't want to sign up for that kind of thing. Don't be a sinner. Number 6, the sixth lesson you learn from Saul is that the command still needs obeying. Verses 31 through 33, Saul repents, Saul goes back, Saul worships the Lord in verse 31. That's great. He's repented. He's presumably forgiven. He's regretting his decision, maybe, or doing whatever. I don't know if you would judge him as legitimate in this passage or not. I go back and forth, probably depending on the day. But here's the thing, in verses 32 and 33, somebody still has to go and cut Agag into pieces, right? Saul's not doing it. Saul hasn't done it. Fine. But someone still has to go and do it. If you disobey God, you can be forgiven, and you can come back to God. That's great. But someone still needs to do the right thing. Someone still needs to do what was commanded. Just because you have come back to God does not free you of your obligation for what you were supposed to do, and it does not free the cosmic obligation of needing to do that thing. So Saul does ask for Samuel to come with him, and this time Samuel does go with him, although the way it's framed, verses 31 and 32, Samuel goes back following Saul. Saul worships the Lord, and Samuel goes to cut this man into pieces. Samuel is not going back with Saul so that he can honor Saul or whatever nonsense Saul is trying to ship him in verse 30, that honor me now before the elders of the people and go back with me, and whatever whatever rubbish he's going after. Samuel is following Saul so that he can go and do Saul's job for him, because Saul takes Agag out and he executes him before the Lord, as it said in verse 33. He cuts Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. Just because you're disobedient doesn't mean that it's not required of you. Just because you're disobedient doesn't excuse you from what you should have done. And it just means the job goes to somebody else. There's still work to be done. If you don't fulfill your job, you can get fired from your job. And someone else is going to have to come in and clear up your mess and do the thing you were supposed to. Your disobedience doesn't excuse you from having to do the thing, but it does burden others with having to do the thing you were supposed to. It's just a nuisance. It's a nuisance for yourself. It's still a burden on yourself, and it's a nuisance for other people. Why would you do it to other people? Why not just obey? It's so much simpler when you obey. That's a lesson you learn from Saul. And ultimately, the saddest lesson is at the end of this in verse 34 and 35 is that when you disobey, when there is disobedience to God, trust is broken. It goes back to the first couple of points. God is upset, God's people are upset, but also look at the level to which this is. Verse 34, Samuel goes to Ramah, Saul went to his house at Gibeah, and verse 35, Samuel doesn't see Saul again. That's it, until the day of his death. Samuel mourned for Saul. It's not that Samuel hated Saul at this point. It's not that Samuel gave up on his love for Saul. It's not that Samuel wished evil upon Saul, but it is that trust is broken. And when you disobey, you fracture trust. You fracture trust with God, and you fracture it with other people who are around you, who are God's people. And sometimes that's something that is recoverable over a long time, but sometimes it's just not. Or sometimes the time it takes to recover from that is too great for this life. Samuel didn't have all that long left, and so he dies before he and Saul can become friends again. There is just too much of a breakage because of what Saul did for that to be repaired in this lifetime. How horrible the consequences for disobeying God. When God commands you to do something, when God commands you to listen to him, how horrible for us to ignore him. Disobeying God gets you nothing. You may feel like you are free from God. You may feel like you have an out. You may feel like you are so much better off because you can do whatever it is you want to do. Great. How's that doing for your life? How has that ever gone for you? Disobeying God gives you nothing, but it risks you everything. And on a pure value proposition, why would you risk so much damage to your life for a few minutes of so-called freedom from God to do whatever and become a slave of sin instead? Even as bad as Saul was, he could have been forgiven. Maybe he was. God is merciful. But even after he's forgiven, or after he asks for forgiveness, there are still things that are broken. There are still consequences that come. And even after he is forgiven, nothing is ever quite the same once that trust is broken and evil has been done, now is it? It's just not worth it. And that's the message that you learn from Saul in 1 Samuel 15. It's kind of depressing. It's a little bit depressing. God called you to destroy them completely. For reasons that we mentioned earlier, it's justified. There's plenty of reason why God is commanding him to do that in that one particular situation. There's plenty of reason why God is commanding that. But Saul, when he refuses to do it, all sorts of consequences for not doing it. Just obey. A lot of the Bible just comes back to that idea. Just obey. Because fundamentally, everything is based on obedience. If you obey, bad things don't happen. There's a reason you should obey. So that's where we'll leave it for now. We'll leave it for there this week. There may be a class coming out on Wednesday. I forget exactly what the schedule is. No, I don't think so. I think this is our off week, and class is not coming out this Wednesday, and maybe actually not next Wednesday as well, because I'm a couple of classes behind in the auditorium class here, or the adult class that we're having going on in the auditorium. So there will be something on Friday for Sermon on the Mount, the next part of Matthew chapter 7. We're about halfway through that, so we'll be getting through that. And as we go through, we're close to finishing. So we'll have to switch topics before the end of May is out. Happy May. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope you benefited from this, and it gives you something to think about. And I will see you on Friday.